Hi, everybody. Zeke Torres, and thanks for continuing to watch and learn more about Git. This segment is all about what Git branches are. So let's go ahead and take a look at an overview at what the idea of branches are. And the easiest way for me to explain it is when Git does its magic, it is because it's a database at its core. It's keeping track of the before image of something and the after image of something. And it ends up using a unique index ID, a very long set of digits, alphanumeric digits. And it's basically the way that Git helps us navigate the changes and versions of something that have been committed, saved, and are meant to be tracked by us using the interfaces that we choose to make sense of it. So in this simplified image, we have an example of a repository where there's a master branch. Now, the lexicon, the naming of things is shifting. It used to be popular to call something a master branch. Now it's changing into main. So there's a main branch that has gone through some iterations. It's here in green or teal, whatever that color is. And what will happen is that there have been two branches that have been created over time. One was for a hotfix, and one was to develop something. So in this example, the main branch changed because somebody did some work and they created a branch called hotfix. They made their changes, their edits, and then they took that branch and merged it back into the main or the master branch. Now, that is the safest way to make edits to whatever we have as content in our main or master branch. One rule that I must stress should be followed is that we never want to make edits directly on our master branch, even though we can. We can make edits on any different place within our Git repository. It's all under our control, under our domain. But by making edits and changes in a branch that is basically an image or a clone of the branch we wish to change, it allows us to protect the documentation, the comments, and the approval and rejections under that branch. So we now know that, for example, if this hotfix had an approval, a rejection, maybe some comments, maybe something that somebody wanted to annotate, we could find that context in that branch if we were to look for the history through this repository. And so we could see that documentation. So this developer also created a branch called develop. They made their edits, their changes, and it went through a few iterations. And so if we wanted to see the history or the chronology of that branch, we could easily find that and follow what the changes were about. And in fact, in this example, while someone or maybe a team was working on that branch called develop, they created yet another branch called feature, which had its own changes, commits, and obviously some approvals, rejections, anything of that nature. But those were all kept under the feature branch, and then they were merged into the develop branch, and eventually that develop branch was merged back into the main or the master branch. Now, we're going to see examples of that, but one of the things I want to highlight is what the purpose of that is and why we don't want to make edits directly to our master branch because we're trying to protect it. And I will give some additional examples as to how we can consider other branches just as important to protect with the same kind of rules. So let's look at what these branch ideas manifest themselves like when we use our editor or our interface, I'm sorry, like GitHub desktop or and to actually create a branch itself. So this is my repository for SAS Global Forum example 1. Remember, we initiated that and created that in an earlier segment. You can see here that I'm on my main branch. There are no other branches. This is basically a new repository. And one of the rules that I like to recommend to people is before you begin any work on a repository locally, you want to fetch or connect to the remote GitHub repository or your Bitbucket repository and make sure all your changes are in sync. What this will do, that type of, process of always fetching before you start to do your work, will enable you to always sync up your local image of your repository to ensure that you have all the right changes or modifications or commits or the histories that maybe other team members have done, or maybe you did and you forgot. And this way you can stay in sync. So I've just done that again. And what I'd like to do is create a new branch. So I'm going to come here and create a branch. I'm going to give it a name, and this is going to be a name that I don't typically like. I'm just going to call it some branch. and I'm going to create it. Now, what this is telling me is that I'm going to end up creating this branch, some branch, that will be based off the image of the main branch. So that is going to basically take the properties, the whatever that main branch looks like, it's going to create basically a branch called some branch that now looks like the main branch. So you didn't see a lot of changes here, but now this says publish branch. Well, we haven't done anything. There isn't anything to publish to push up to our GitHub repository. It did switch to the some branch, and I can switch back to the main branch. So let's go ahead and switch that. We've switched to main branch. You can see the check mark. I'm going to switch back to some branch, and I don't have anything to publish. I won't do that yet, but I am going to go into the Explorer to see what I can do or what looks different. So here's my Explorer. Here is the window to the folder, SASGF form example 1. There's nothing there. I haven't done anything, but it shows that I'm on some branch. Here's that README file. Why don't we edit that and show what that looks like? So let's do this. Here's my README file, and it has an example of how to initiate. This is what was typed and done by GitHub. So I'm going to add in a new comment on some branch. And I'm going to save that. And we're going to start to see GitHub Desktop actually show us that something has changed. So what GitHub Desktop has done is it's noticed that there is a difference in a file, one changed file, and it is actually showing us with this green highlighting what has changed inside of that readme.md. So if I try to switch branches right now, it won't, and I'm going to show you that in a second. But the reason why it won't is because although Git is tracking that change, it has no idea if I'm happy with that change and want to commit it, or if I am not happy with that change and want to do something else with it. So let me go ahead and show you that. I'm going to try and switch to main, and GitHub is basically saying, wait. You have changes on this branch. What would you like to do? Do you want to leave the changes on some branch and we can kind of stash it away for this on the side for a second? Or do you want to bring the changes into main? Do I want to kind of, mesh them into main? We don't want to mesh into main. In fact, I want to stop what I'm doing. I want to show you why. If I leave my changes and switch back to main for some reason to look at something that I might have wanted to, verify, validate, I can do that. But what I really want to highlight is that I've made a change. Git has noticed it. It's asking me really to just commit the change, to make the change something that it will now protect or lock or save. The best example that I can explain to people is that Git commits are the new save early, save often. So let's go ahead and document the change that was done. Updated the README MD. I made a change to the README with a new line. That message will now be part of the Git log, will now be a record of what took place. The better you can describe what you've done, the better you can make your documentation at this stage, the more helpful it will be, not just to you, but to others, or the future you in a week, in a month, or maybe in an hour after you come back from lunch, to understand what changes we're going through at that moment when you made this commit. So I'm going to commit this to the some branch. So we now have a history here. We have a history that shows me that I've made an update to the readme.md. The changes are part of that branch. Now, if I want to switch back to the main branch, I can switch to the main branch. It doesn't give me that message that asks me, what would you like to do with the change that you haven't committed? So let's go back to some branch. And let's look at the Explorer again. In the Explorer, we can see that if I open the Explorer while I'm in some branch and open up the MD file, we can see there's a new comment on some branch. I'm going to close this and I'm going to switch branches again. I'm going to switch back to the main branch and I'm going to open up my Explorer and I'm going to open up that README. That line isn't there. What Git does when we switch branches is it allows us to toggle between those two versions that we're managing. It allows us to switch from one branch to the other and the branch's contents. It allows us to switch from whatever's happening in that main branch or the master branch and switch to that hotfix or some branch that we were working on. And it doesn't mix or mesh unless we choose to merge the branch. So here's why that's important. What we can do with this feature of branching and of managing those changes is we can create a new branch to work on something. And again, this other work branch that I'm creating is going to be based off whatever the image is of main, and I'm going to create that branch. And so now I have a third branch. I have my main branch, my sum branch, and my other work branch. And each of these are distinct until I choose to mesh and merge them. So we're going to talk about merging in a separate segment, but I want to make sure that people understand what branching as a basic is. Now, having said and having given you an idea of what branches are, the next important thing to talk about to help you is a naming convention that will assist you with your branches. So one of the things that I recommend for people to have is we're all going to have something called a main branch, and that's a given. But if we have only ourselves in a solo work environment or other people that are going to help us, one recommendation that I have for naming branches is have the first 2, 3, 4 letters be the initials or some identification of who the developer is, who the person is that's making changes. So for me, let's say that would be ZT for Zeke Torres. And then I recommend a second level of a name after a hyphen that would indicate the type of project or maybe the type of changes or the related context of what we're doing. So maybe this will be like an update. And then the third section of this name could be anything. It could be, just testing work, or it could be if I want to, maybe a new join. So that would be a recommended manner in which to name your branches. So if I had a colleague and her name was Sally Smith, her initials would be the first 2 digits, and then she might be working on an upgrade, and then she might type in some kind of test code as an additional description. And let's say we have a monthly production. So we could have a branch called monthly production, and we could have a branch called annual production. We could have all sorts of branches inside of our repository. But the rule that I like to recommend to people is for personal branches that you're working on for developing your own code, give them a naming or a prefixing that allows you to identify who is in charge or responsible for that branch and what that branch purpose is with the second part of the name, like what it's related to. It could be a ticket or a project, and then what the basic description is for that person who's responsible for that branch to remember. But we could have branches that are team related. So the main branch should always be considered a team related branch. The other branches that are not something that someone is in charge of by themselves could have a name like monthly prod or annual prod, or maybe it would have a name like, the West report or the national report. These are all branches that could be protected in the same rule scenario that you wouldn't want to make a change directly to this branch or to this branch or to any branch unless you are the owner of that branch. So let me explain that rule. The main branch should not ever be updated within the main branch itself. We want a separate branch so we can track the changes in the commits and then approve them and merge them back to the main branch. So if I ever finished my work in this branch, eventually we would request some kind of approval, and it would get merged back to main. And so once it becomes part of main, I would delete that branch, and main would have all the changes and all the edits that I've made. And then Sally would eventually do the same thing. She would eventually request a merge, and then eventually that would be merged back to main. And once she's done with that process of seeking that approval, my main branch would now have both my changes and her changes together. But we never want, as a single developer, to actually work on the main branch without some separate branch to actually make those edits distinct with the logs and the history. So if my team or myself had a monthly production branch, I would have the same bureaucracy, the same rules, or an annual production branch, the same rules, that if you're going to make an upgrade to this branch, what you want to do is you want to actually create a new branch, and I would create a ZT annual prod branch and maybe some test work. And eventually, when I'm done with that branch, I would request an approval, and it would be merged to the annual prod branch. And once that approval's been granted, then we know that this annual prod branch has been modified and it's been made improved, or it's included now with all of the changes from the previous branches. And in some cases, some teams will eventually request for this branch to be merged into the main branch. And so once that happens, that branch will now be part of the main branch here. So we could go through that, and we could have some branch that went back into main. And if that's the case, and if we needed to see the history, well, we could come and see the history of those branches and see the changes that took place via the actual chronological changes that took place. We're going to be able to see that more in the examples that we have ahead, but this is the type of naming convention that I want to recommend people to have, and to understand that, again, users should be in charge of their own branches, and you should identify them with a prefix that's unique to them, right? And John Doe would have his own, or Jane Doe would have her own branches, and then we would have something like a West report, and then some other name here. Sally is working on the national report, and then some other name here, and then Jane Doe, she's working on the monthly, and then some other name there. So all of these branches can exist in our repository. They can exist in different states, and they will not interfere with each other. And they may or may not be merged back into main or into these other branches that are team branches. But another rule, Sally should never make changes to Zeke's branches, and John Doe should never make changes to Sally's branches. As well as, you don't want Zeke erasing or deleting Sally's branches. Branches become something like a folder, but within Git. So when you start to think about branches as folders, it makes it a little bit easier to understand why I wouldn't delete somebody else's folder on some drive or some network storage folder. I wouldn't delete a team folder or modify a team folder unless I ask the team to validate or verify what's going on. So if we apply that same philosophy to branches, that anybody on the team will not simply just go in and change something that's a team folder or a team branch, and anybody on the team will not modify or delete somebody else's branch or somebody else's work, then it starts to make sense as to why that rule exists. It's because we are trying to protect each other. We are trying to protect the team from accidentally making changes without the context of the logs or the history of those changes. So I hope that helps everybody. We're going to see more of what branches are as we go here, but those are the basic rules that I wanted to get across. The do's and the don'ts of what the namings are, and the do's and the don'ts of why we want to protect our team members and our team branches from accidental changes, or even, miscellaneous changes that we think are really easy to make, but we may make trouble for ourselves. Branches are very, very useful, and they're very, very powerful, especially with code like Sass, where we want to toggle between different versions. So I hope that helps you, and pretty soon we're going to start talking more about commits and putting all these different pieces together. Thanks.